Good morning. Thank you also. How are you guys doing? How's the conference been for everyone? Pretty good? It's been great. I have to say, it's been this is my fourth time at Aspen, and this might be my favorite time so far. It's just been wonderful. My name is Charles Duhigg. I'm a writer at the New Yorker magazine and the author of a couple books, including The Power of Habit and my latest Supercommunicators that we're going to be talking about today. And I just want to start by thanking all of you for coming out this morning. I come to Aspen every single year because it's one of the best experiences to be able to meet diverse viewpoints and to meet interesting people that I might not bump into otherwise. And it's often because people bring their best selves to this event. And I'm going to actually punish you for bringing your best selves to this event, because what I'm going to ask you to do with me this morning is I'm going to ask you to participate in an experiment. And this experiment is, and I did this a couple years ago, you might remember it if you were here before. This experiment is that I'm going to ask you to turn to the person next to you and ask and answer each other one question. And the question that you are going to have to ask and answer each other is this: when is the last time you cried in front of another person? Now, how many of you are really enthusiastic about this exercise? This seems like a great idea. A couple people, okay. Couple of weirdos here who are like, I love talking about crying. Everyone else is like, I did not show up at 9 o'clock in the morning to have a therapy session with a stranger. But what I am hoping to do over the next 30 minutes is convince you that not only is this a good idea to do today, this is a good idea to do every day. You should do this with your friends, with your coworkers, depending on your workplace rules, with the strangers that you meet on the bus. And to explain why I think this is such a good idea, I have to tell you how I started working on Supercommunicators. So a couple years ago, I got into this bad pattern with my wife, which I'm guessing, how many folks are in a relationship in this room? Yeah, okay, so if this sounds familiar to you, let me know. I would come home from work and I would start complaining about my day. And I would say, my boss doesn't appreciate me and my coworkers are jerks, and go on. And she would say, very reasonably and very practically, she would say, look, why don't you take your boss out to lunch and you guys can get to know each other a little bit better and that'll help out. And instead of being able to hear her good advice, I would get even more upset. And I would say something like, why aren't you on my side? Why are you siding with them? You should be supporting me. You should be outraged on my behalf. Then she would get upset because I was attacking her for giving me really good advice. How many folks in this room have had this experience in conversations with your significant? Yeah, literally all of us do this, right? Again and again and again. And so I went to these researchers. What was interesting was it wasn't just at home, it was also at work, right? The same thing would happen when I was in meetings. People would come to me with problems that I would try and solve their problems and they would get upset. And so I went to researchers and I asked them, what is going on here? I'm a professional communicator. Why do I and so many people I know, why do we keep making the same mistake over and over and over again? And what they said was, well, it's a good thing you came and asked, because we're actually living through this golden age of understanding communication for really the first time. Because of advances in neural imaging and data collection, we now know what happens inside your brain when you're in a conversation with someone. And what they said is, we tend to assume that every discussion is about one thing, right? We're talking about where to go on vacation next year, or our budget, or my day at work, or what someone said to me. But every discussion is not actually one conversation. Instead, every discussion is made up of multiple kinds of conversations. And these conversations, they tend to all fall into one of three buckets on average. There are these, I'm needing to make sure I'm catching up on the slides. There are these practical conversations, right, where we're solving problems together, or we're making plans together. But then there's also these times that I come to you and I want to have an emotional conversation. And in that conversation, I'm telling you how I'm feeling, and I don't want you to solve my feelings. I want you to empathize, and I want you to tell me that you relate. And then there's also these social conversations, right, where we talk about how we relate to each other, how we relate to society, the identities that we carry around that are important to us. And what the researchers said is, what we've discovered is that if two people are having different kinds of conversations, they can't hear each other. They can't connect with each other. They can't become what's known in the language of neuroscience as neurally entrained, thinking alike, because they're literally using different parts of their brains. And that's exactly what, of course, was happening with me and my wife, right? I was having an emotional conversation, and she was having a practical conversation, and as a result, we both felt frustrated with each other. And that frustration felt like it got worse and worse and worse, They're both equally legitimate conversations. There was a time and a place for both of them, but because we weren't having the same kind of conversation at the same moment, we weren't connecting. On the other hand, though, when people do have the same kind of conversation at the same moment, that's when suddenly you feel that sense that this person knows you. And within psychology, this has become known as the matching principle. That in order to genuinely communicate with another person, you need to be having the same kind of conversation at the same moment. You need to either match them or you need to invite them to match you. But somehow, you have to come together so that you begin to think alike. And at that moment, something magical happens. Now, it's an interesting question, though. How do we actually do this, right? Well, in schools, particularly in New York and New Jersey, they've started teaching. Is anyone a teacher here? Okay, so I don't know if you've learned this. With new teachers, they've started teaching them a method, which is that they say to them, when a student comes up to you and they have a problem, something they want to talk about, or just even a meaningful conversation, what you should do is you should start the conversation by asking them, well, do you want to be helped? Do you want to be hugged? Or do you want to be heard? Which, of course, are the three kinds of conversations, right? The emotional, the practical, and the social. Now, that being said, in the workplace, this is a little bit harder, right? If you ask one of your coworkers, would you like to be hugged? They might call HR right away. So for those of us who are not teachers, we need to find a different technique. And one solution, one way to figure out what kind of a conversation someone is having, what kind of a mindset they are, to invite them, is to ask questions. Now, everyone in this room, I'm sure, is very, very good at asking questions. And one of the things that we know about supercommunicators, and we are all supercommunicators at one time or another, but consistent supercommunicators is that they tend to ask 10 to 20 times as many questions as the average person. And the questions that they ask are special. Because many of us are very, very practiced at asking surface questions, right? But what's more powerful is to ask someone a deep question. And a deep question, this is from psychology, is something that's very specific. It's something that asks about your values or your beliefs or your experiences. And that can sound kind of intimidating, right? Like you're going to have this personal conversation right away. You're going to have to tell someone the last time you cried. But actually, it's as simple as if you meet someone and you ask them, oh, where do you work? Oh, I'm a doctor. Instead of saying, oh, what hospital do you work at? Ask them, oh, what do you love about your job? What made you decide to go to medical school? What's it like to be a doctor? If you meet someone from your hometown and you say, oh, where'd you go to high school? And they say, oh, I went to Valley High School. Kind of a conversational dead end. But if you ask, what was that like for you? Like, did you enjoy high school? Was it a good time? Are you glad you moved away? These are questions that invite others to say something meaningful and real and personal about who they are. They don't mandate it, but they invite it. And what we know is that if instead of asking people about the facts of their life, if you ask them how they feel about their life, they will tell you something about who they really are. And we can do this in any setting. There's a guy named Nicholas Epley, who's a professor at the University of Chicago, and he's studied deep questions his entire career. And he does this thing where once a month, he'll go onto a bus in Chicago, he'll sit down next to a stranger, and he sets a goal for himself. And the goal is to get to this person's hopes and dreams within 3 questions. And when I was asking him about this, I was like, that sounds like the worst experience on the face of the planet. I would never want to do that. And he's like, actually, it usually only takes 2 questions. It's really easy. Because I sit down next to someone and I say, oh, what do you do for a living? And they say, oh, I'm an accountant. And he says, oh, did you always want to be an accountant? Was that your dream as a kid? And the person says, no, of course not. Nobody wants to be an accountant when you're a kid. I wanted to be an astronaut, but I became an accountant. And suddenly they're talking about how he went from wanting to be an astronaut to being an accountant and what his life is like. And Nick starts sharing about his own life. And these people walk away feeling closer to each other, feeling like they had a real connection, even for just a moment or two. Now, this brings us to our first assignment. This isn't the big assignment. This isn't the experiment, but I want to give us a chance to practice a little bit. And here's what I'm going to ask you to do. I'm going to ask you to turn to the person next to you and ask about anything you want for the first question. But within 2 questions, I want you to get to dreams or experiences. And we're going to do it for 1 minute and then trade places and do it for another minute and just kind of notice how it goes. Everyone ready? Take it away. If you haven't already, go ahead and switch places and just flip-flop. Okay, our timer got a little bit screwed up. Let me go ahead and ask you, I promise you're gonna get more opportunity to speak with each other. So let me ask you to curtail, ready? Shh. As evidenced by the fact that it actually took you guys a little while to actually stop doing that, how did that go? How many people that was fun? Got to know the person next to you? How many people was like, that's the worst god-awful experience I've ever had in my entire life? One guy right here. And it's his wife sitting next to him, which is a weird thing. So the question is, why did that feel good, right? Why did that feel like something that was kind of enjoyable and pleasurable? Well, here's what I'm gonna posit, and I wanna hear from you later on about that experience. What I'm gonna posit is, it felt good because you were a little bit vulnerable with each other. Because you said something that felt like you were revealing something. And the other person responded, reciprocated. And this moment of vulnerability feels really, really rewarding. Now, there's an interesting thing about vulnerability because we tend to forget what it is or get it wrong. We think vulnerability means I'm gonna cry on your shoulder or I have to ask you something deep and personal, but actually vulnerability is an emotion that occurs simply when we say something that we could be judged. I could tell you, I like Star Trek more than Star Wars. And you could judge me for that. And I don't care. I don't care about your judgment. I don't care what you think about it. I don't care if you think that I'm right or wrong, but the act of saying something that you could judge makes me feel vulnerable. And when someone else reciprocates by saying, oh, that's funny, I like Indiana Jones 2 better than Indiana Jones 1, and I say, I don't care about Indiana Jones, it doesn't matter what my judgment is, it's the fact that you said something that opened you to judgment, that feels vulnerable and feels real, and because of evolution, is hardwired into our brains to make us feel closer to each other. And this is actually really, really powerful. And to tell you how powerful it can be, I want to tell you a story about this guy, Bafar Adai. Dr. Adai is a physician at Sloan Kettering in New York City. And he's probably the best prostate surgeon on the planet. So every single day, patients come into his office having just learned that there's a tumor that has started growing on their prostate. They have prostate cancer. And they come to him and say, what should I do? And so what he does is he gives them advice. And what he says to them is this. He says, look, the thing about prostate cancer is those tumors are incredibly slow growing. In fact, there's a saying among physicians that for older patients, they'll probably die of old age before they die of their cancer. And so the safest thing we can do, the most certain way to make sure that the cancer doesn't spread, is we can go in and we can cut it out. The problem with that, though, is that the prostate is located really close to the nerves that control urination and sexual function, and in some percentage of patients, there are lifelong side effects that diminish the quality of their life, even as we make sure that they're never threatened by cancer. And so he says, look, here's the advice I'm gonna give you. What you should do instead is you should do this thing called active surveillance. So what we're gonna do is every 6 months, we're gonna take a blood sample and we're gonna test your PSA levels. Every 2 years, we're gonna biopsy the tumor to make sure that it's not growing. If it does start to grow, we're gonna put you in an MRI and see if it's growing faster than we expect it to. And if that all happens, then at that point, we can do surgery. But until that happens, my advice, don't do anything. Don't get radiation, don't get surgery, don't take any weird supplements, literally just engage in what's known as watchful waiting. So he would go ahead and give this advice. He would tell patients what he thinks they should do. The patient would listen, the patient would go home, they would discuss it with their spouse, they would come in the next morning and they would say, I absolutely want you to cut me open as fast as humanly possible and take the tumor out. Just get rid of it immediately. And for Dr. Adai, this was bewildering, right? Because they had come to him for his advice. They had come to him because he's an expert. And here they are, ignoring his advice. Or he realizes more accurately, not able to hear his advice, not able to hear what he's saying. And he actually told me, when this happens again and again and again, you start to realize this isn't a problem with your patients. This is a problem with you, with how you're communicating. So he goes and he finds some experts at the Harvard Business School who focus on what's known as soft negotiations, everyday negotiations. These are the kinds of negotiations that we don't even realize are negotiations, like when we're talking about where to go on vacation next year, and we're pushing for the beach, and our spouse is pushing for the city, or when we're trying to convince our kid that, in fact, a tattoo is the worst choice they will ever make in their entire life. These are negotiations that happen every single day. And they came and they followed him around for a little bit, and they said, look, we think we figured out the mistake you're making. When you start this conversation, you're having a surface conversation. You assume that these people are coming in seeking your advice. And so what you start doing is you start giving them advice. But the first rule of a negotiation is you never assume what the other person wants. You have to ask them what they want because it might be hidden even to them. What you need to do, they told him, is you need to have a deep conversation. And to do that, you need to ask deep questions. So 2 weeks later, after having this interaction, 62-year-old patient comes into Dr. Duhigg's office for the first time. The man had just learned that he has prostate cancer. And normally, Dr. Duhigg would have gone into a song and dance, but this time he does something different. This time he starts the conversation by saying, tell me, what does this cancer diagnosis mean to you? And the man kind of takes a moment, and then he says, well, you know, when they told me about it, the first thing I thought about was my father, because he died when I was 17 years old. And I saw what that did to like me and my sisters and my mom. And I would never want to put my wife or my kids through that. And then the other thing I started thinking about is at work. Like, I'm 62. I want to work for like another 10 years, or if I'm the president of the United States, another 30. He said, if they know at work, if these young kids at work know that I have cancer, they're going to start seeing me completely differently. I'm suddenly going to be the old sick guy, not the mentor. And then he starts talking about his grandchildren and his fears for them, what with like, climate change and politics. The guy goes on for 10 minutes. Never once does he mention cancer, his health, his fears of pain, his mortality. All he wants to do is have an emotional conversation with Dr. Duhigg. And so what Dr. Duhigg does is he leans in, he matches him. He starts talking about the fact that his father had gotten sick 7 years earlier, and his father had all the same concerns that this man was mentioning, but that there were also these, it's too strong to call them silver linings, but there were these special moments that they had conversations about things that they never had talked about before, and probably never would have unless his dad was sick. That his dad had actually decided to take more time to spend with his grandchildren. Dr. Duhigg, in other words, hugged him. And there's a big lesson here, which is that when we ask others deep questions, it invites them to tell us what they want from this conversation. And once we know what they want and what we want, we can begin to match each other. Which is all well and good, right? But then what do you do with that? Because just asking deep questions is something we can all practice, and by the way, if you do practice it, it'll become automatic very, very quickly. But what do we do with this information once we have it? Well, to tell you how to use this, I want to tell you another story, and this is the story of NASA. So in the early 1980s, President Ronald Reagan went to NASA and he told them, what I want you to do is I want you to build a space station and start having missions that are 6 to 12 months long. For NASA, this was like a big deal because up till this point, their longest missions had been about 10 days long. And what they had found out is that over 10 days, you can basically put anyone into space and it's going to work out okay, right? It doesn't matter if they're a great person, if they're a jerk, if they're someone who takes instructions well, takes instructions badly. In 10 days, their personality characteristics aren't going to matter. But if they're going to start putting people up into space for 6 months or for 12 months, if you're living among your coworkers for that long in a little tin can surrounded by vacuum, they need to start finding people who have emotional intelligence. Because the thing is, if you can put a jerk into space for 10 days, but if you put a jerk into space for 6 months, they are all going to kill each other. And in fact, there had been a couple of incidents where real jerks had gotten on each other's nerves enough to ruin a mission. So they start asking themselves, what do we do in order to help our astronauts? What do we do in order to find astronauts who have more emotional intelligence? Now, one of the interesting issues about this is that emotional intelligence is actually very hard to measure. For instance, when I asked Midjourney, one of the AI engines, to give me a portrait of 2 astronauts with emotional intelligence, it gave me this, which I think is pretty accurate, right? That's exactly what we would expect. The bigger issue is that When you get to the final rounds of an astronaut interview, you look like this, right? You look amazing. You're handsome or beautiful. You have 2 PhDs. You've been a fighter pilot. And most importantly, you have been doing interviews your entire life. So you know how to fake emotional intelligence better than anyone else. And the problem for NASA in doing these interviews was that they could not tell the difference between people who were faking emotional intelligence from people who really had emotional intelligence. And this turned out to be a problem because they hired all these people who they thought had high emotional intelligence, and then they would put them up into space, and then things would fall apart. So they turned to this guy, Terry McGuire, the lead psychiatrist for manned spaceflight, and asked him to help. Now, you'll notice in this photo, Terry McGuire is wearing like the astronaut uniform or outfit you wear in space. He's never been into space. He worked for NASA for like 37 years. One day a year, they let you come in and dress up in the outfit and get your picture taken. And Terry loved this. He would show up every single year. His daughter has like photo after photo after photo. But they turned to Terry McGuire, who's a pretty interesting, kind of kooky guy, and they say, look, figure out which astronauts actually have emotional intelligence. And so he starts working on it. Can't come up with anything. A year goes by, 2 years go by, he can't come up with any questions that actually figure out who has emotional intelligence and who's really good at faking that they have emotional intelligence. And then one day he's listening to taped recordings of astronauts who had been, when they had been interviewed, and he knew which of them went on to be good, really strong leaders, and which of them kind of washed out because they couldn't play nice with others. And as he's listening to these interviews, he notices something interesting, which is the really good astronauts, they laugh differently than everyone else. So he comes up with this new test. Now what he does is he asks the astronaut to come in and for an interview. He walks into the interview room, and he's holding this big stack of papers, and as he walks in, he trips as if on accident, and he spills the papers, and then he goes, I am such a klutz. And then he pays attention to what the astronaut candidate does. Because everyone laughs back. We know that if someone makes a mistake and they laugh, that we should laugh back. But some of the candidates would go like this. That's really silly. Let me give you a hand picking those up. And some of the astronaut candidates would go, that is really silly. Let me give you a hand and pick those up. That second group, what they knew, what all of us know, is that we've all been in this situation where you make a mistake, and then you compound the mistake by overreacting, and you're even more embarrassed because you laughed this big, uncomfortable laugh after spilling your papers. And some of the people said, let me help you just sort of sweep this under the rug. And some of the people said, I want to make you feel welcome here. I want to show you that it's okay. I want to match you. Because in doing so, I say, you laughed a big laugh and I laughed a big laugh. It's okay. Those were the candidates who had emotional intelligence. Those were the candidates who went on to be fantastic leaders within NASA. And there's a lesson here, and the lesson is that we prove we are listening to other people. We show them that we want to know what kind of conversation that they have, that we're matching them, and in doing so, that shows them that we want to connect. And the interesting thing is we can all prove that we're listening, right? Laughter is a really good example of this. Studies show that 80% of the time when you laugh, it is not in response to something funny. You have not heard a joke. You laugh in order to show the people you're talking to that you want to connect with them, and they laugh back to show that they want to connect with you in return. Or when someone comes to us and they have a problem, and we don't try and solve their problem for them, we try and console them, we try and tell them, it's okay, I hear you and I see you. What we're really saying is, this is a problem, and I just want you to know I want to connect with you. I want to be here for you. This is particularly important to show that we're listening in conflicts. And in fact, we prove that we're listening through a technique known as looping for understanding. And this technique has 3 steps. The first step is that you should ask a question, preferably a deep question. The second step is that you should summarize what you heard in your own words. Don't mimic what they just said, but show them that you've been listening, paying attention. Show them, more importantly, that you're processing it. And then the third step, and this is the one we usually forget, is ask if you got it right. Because when you ask if you got it right, what you're actually doing is you are asking them for permission to acknowledge that you have been listening. And what we know about how our brains work is that when I believe you are listening to me, I become much more likely to listen to you in return. I can hardly even help but listen to you in return. And that brings us to our experiment. Okay, just to remind you what we're going to do here. Your assignment is I'm going to ask you to turn to your neighbor, either the person you were just talking to. It's best even if it's a stranger, someone you don't know at all. So feel free to move around if you'd like to. I'm going to ask you to ask the question and have the other person answer it. We're going to do that for 2.5 minutes. Then we're going to trade places for another 2.5 minutes. And just in case you've forgotten, the question I'm going to ask you to ask and answer to each other is, when was the last time you cried in front of another person? Now, before this starts, I want you to imagine what this experience is going to be like, and whether you think it's going to be really fun or not so much fun. Everyone ready? Take it away. Okay, if you haven't traded places, let me ask you just to sort of switch. That was 2.5 that was up there before? Don't worry about it. Okay, so I'm gonna, my timer was a little bit off, so I'm gonna ask everyone to stop, if you don't mind. Well, I promise you'll get a chance to talk to each other more after the session. Shh. Excellent. I'll tell you a funny little story. Nick Epley, the guy I mentioned before, he's done this experiment like hundreds of times, and he keeps track of how long it takes a crowd to quiet down when he asks them to quiet down. He said the absolute fastest group is 4th graders, because if you go, it's time to stop, and you put up your hand, they all shut up immediately. And the worst group is he went to this conference of hedge funders, and they just would not shut up for like 20 minutes. They just wanted to talk about how much they cried and how they love each other so much. So let me ask, what happened? For how many of you did that conversation go better than you anticipated it would? Okay, that's a lot of How many of you did that conversation go about exactly as well as you thought it would? Okay, good number of you. For how many of you was that way worse than you thought it was going to go? That was just a terrible, terrible. No one ever raises their hand when I ask this question. So I'm going to ask you, we have a couple of mic runners. I'm going to ask you to tell, if anyone's comfortable, to tell me what that conversation was like. And you don't have to go into the details, the content, but just what the experience of the conversation was like, how it felt to have it. Anyone? Yeah, over here.
Michelle and I don't know each other, and we discovered we both had cried just a week or two ago. And one of them was because I lost my best friend, and her because her best friend lost her father. Oh. And she remembered her father. So it was this deep emotion of remembering of the loss.
And discovering this thing that you had in common that probably you wouldn't have known about otherwise.
Right.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. Who else? Who else had a... over here. Yes, ma'am. Sure, I think they want to record it, so they'll bring it over.
That was my husband, by the
way.
I recognize the voice. I have a question more than the sharing of the experience. Well, it is a sharing of the experience. Is what made you feel the best? To listen to your partner or to listen to yourself? Going and expressing the emotion to the other person.
Well, let me ask you, so what did feel best?
My partner was a little bit short with words, and he got into an intimate a moment that I did not feel I could ask more, although I was very curious to ask more about it. So I could expand a lot more because mine was not an intimate. It was a subtle, loving moment, but it was not an intimate moment. It was not a conflict moment. Yeah. So I could go on and on and on. So therefore, I felt I could relate to what my partner had said, and maybe said, I think I went through the same experience myself. Yeah. But I got more out of my own sharing of the emotion.
And that's great. Thank you so much. This is wonderful. And we'll talk a little bit about what's going on there. I think there was one other hand in the gold jacket.
Yeah, thank you for these questions. Very powerful. The part that was most powerful in our discussion was his reflection back of what I said and helping me kind of connect dots about the experience that I was crying about. And I shared that I was feeling after the wave of backlash from DEI and the murder of George Floyd and doing the work for several years, feeling numb now, but not really knowing why I was crying more then and not now. He helped me see that the crying was in seeing like the loss of hope as things progressively got worse, and that was just a huge epiphany to support me in my journey.
And sir, can I ask, what was the conversation like for you, for his partner?
For me?
Yeah.
Yeah, I felt I learned a lot that crying is not only about sadness, but it's about hope. And that really, that really left me
That's really powerful.
A deeper understanding of
Thank
people.
you. So let's talk about what happened here. When Nick Epley has done this experiment a number of times, he does a survey afterwards. And what he finds is that people say that they felt much more connected to the person they were talking to than they expected. That they felt like that person was more caring than they thought they would be. That they felt like they listened really attentively, right? They were paying attention. And a number of people, a surprising number of people say, this is one of the best conversations I've had in the last month. And there's this interesting question, why? The question you raised about, is it hearing myself speak or is it hearing someone else? Is it learning from someone or having someone help me connect the dots? These are really, really important questions. And so what happened? What made this experience a positive one? Well, the first thing is, obviously, you started by asking a deep question. The second thing that you inevitably did is you proved that you were listening. You proved that you were not only hearing the person's words, but processing them, helping them make the connections, and talking about how it affects you. But these aren't the only reasons why this conversation was powerful. there's one more reason that's really, really important. And to explain what it is, I need to tell you a story about these two folks. Arthur and Elaine Aaron, who are they're a married couple. They're both research psychologists at SUNY Stony Brook. And a number of years ago, they had an experiment. And the experiment that was, they wanted to figure out, how can I take two strangers together and make them into friends? Like, not just most of the time, all the time. And so they come up with all these theories. And their first theory is, okay, I'm going to have them do puzzles together. Didn't work. I'm going to have them tell each other stories about their lives. Didn't work. I'm going to have them tell each other jokes. I'm going to have them do like an outdoors experience together. I'm going to have them hum together. I'm going to have them tap their fingers together. And what they found is that with every single intervention, some people would become friends and some people wouldn't, and just the same normal distribution that you would see with any kind of bringing two people together. And then they come up with a new idea. Their new idea is they write down 36 questions. And they say, what we're going to do is we're going to have people ask and answer these questions to each other. And some of these questions were relatively easy. They were things like, given the choice of anyone in the world, who would you want as a dinner guest? That's easy to answer. They get a little bit harder after a little while. Do you have a secret hunch about how you will die? What is your most terrible memory? How do you feel about your mother, right? At some point, it starts getting more and more intimate. And then question number 35 is, or 31 is, when is the last time you cried in front of another person? So they bring people two by two into this room, strangers never met before. This is the early 90s, so there isn't a lot of internet out there yet. They sit them down on this yellow carpet. They hand them the list of questions. They say, you have 45 minutes, go back and forth, answer the questions. Afterwards, they come in and they say, thank you so much for your time. Everyone assumes the experiment's over. They send everyone home. They don't give anyone contact information or anything like that. They don't even ask them to introduce themselves to each other. And then 7 weeks later, they call up everyone who had been in that room. And they ask them just one question. Just out of curiosity, since you did the experiment, have you seen that other person? Like, have you talked to them? And people would say things like, oh yeah, you know, when we left, I knew his name was John S., but I didn't know his last name, and so I got the white pages, and I called every single John S. in the white pages until I found him. Or because there were some students, they had students who said, every Friday night I would walk up and down the hallway of a different dorm looking for that person. They actually found one guy who said, yeah, you know, I went for a beer, and then, you know, I went for a movie with her, and now things are changing a little bit. And a year later, when they got married, they invited everyone in the lab to come to the wedding. You probably know this study is the 32 questions that lead to love when it's been published. What they found is that 70% of the people who had been in those rooms sought out the other person to have a relationship with them. And the reason why is because they felt so close to them. They felt so connected. Just asking and answering those questions, telling someone why the last time you cried in front of another person feels like you are connected to that person in a meaningful way. When they eventually published their results, this became known as the Fast Friends procedure, and it's one of the most famous studies in psychological sciences. This procedure is used all the time in experiments. And what's interesting, though, is that there is a specific reason why it works. In addition to those deep questions, in addition to listening to each other, when they did the experiment again, and instead of having people go back and forth, they would hand them the same questions, and they would say, okay, one person, answer all 36 questions, then hand the questions to the next person, and they'll answer all 36 questions. It didn't work. Afterwards, people say, it felt weird, I was bored, I don't really like that person that much. There's something about going back and forth that is a magical element to make this work. And within psychology, this is known as reciprocal authenticity. That when someone tells us something about their life, and then we say something about our lives, we are hardwired to like each other more. That when someone says something really revealing, and we say, what I hear you saying is this and this and this, and I know how that feels, I know what it feels to be excluded, that act of reciprocating vulnerability, that act of reciprocating authenticity, it opens up something in our brain that makes us feel closer and more connected to the other person. It makes us trust them more. It makes us like them more. And the reason why is because I mentioned before this idea of neural entrainment. When you are in a good conversation, your body starts to match the other person. Your heart rate will start to match each other. Your breath patterns will start to match each other. Even if you're on Zoom without realizing it, your pupils will begin dilating at the same rate. And more importantly, you will begin thinking alike. And this makes sense when you think about it, because if I describe to you an emotion that I'm having, you kind of experience that emotion a little bit, right? If I tell you that I have an idea, you experience the idea. It makes sense that our brains would become more and more similar. And what we know from studies, particularly by a guy named Uri Hassan at Princeton University, is that the more similar our brains become, the more we hear each other. The more we hear all the nuances and the details, the more we remember about the conversation, and most importantly, the closer we feel to each other, the more connected we feel. This is why those three kinds of conversations are so important, is because when I'm having an emotional conversation and my wife is having a practical conversation, we are using different parts of our brains. It's very hard for us to become entrained. But when we match each other just for a moment, then we stay matched together. Then we can move from emotional to practical to social and back to emotional together. And it feels wonderful. Our brains have evolved to feel great after a conversation because this entrainment helps us build communities. It helps us build meaningful lives. Now, the thing I'll mention is we are obviously living through a time right now where it is harder to have these kinds of conversations, particularly with people that we don't know. But the thing that I would say, whether you're a Biden voter and they're a Trump voter, or whether you're Catholic and they're Jewish, or whether you're pro-Gaza or pro-Israel, not that these things are all in opposition to each other, when we're having those conversations and we try and match each other, it doesn't mean that we have to agree with each other, but it does mean that we can connect. Communication is Homo sapiens' superpower. It is the thing that has allowed our species to succeed so well. And as we have evolved, our brains have become amazing communication devices. And the thing that we need to do in order to make that superpower become real is we have to say, I'm going to go into this conversation, and I don't want to convince this person that I'm right and they're wrong, or that they should like me, or that I'm smart, or that they should vote for my guy. I want to go into this conversation just to understand how you see the world, just to match you and invite you to match me. Because when we do that, we feel connected to each other. And our nation and our world has always been at its best when we prioritize connection over everything else. And that doesn't mean that this election is going to be any easier than it's going to be. And it doesn't mean the next 4 years, regardless of who wins, is going to be easy. But it does mean you are going to be surrounded by people that even if you disagree with them, you admire them and you respect them, and they admire and respect you. And you will feel like the world is a better, more connected place. I have a couple minutes for questions if anyone has any. And then I want to mention I will be signing books out in the lobby if anyone wants a book signed. Where's the mic runner? Maybe this right here? And then I'll come over here, just so you can.
I have a question on parenting. Sometimes, as a parent, when I ask an emotional conversation, especially for my older children, they'll say, "Okay, Ma, I gotta go." So how do you get around that? And especially, you don't always have the ability to do face-to-face. It's phone, it's email. Email gives negative tone. So what's your...
Can I ask, when you ask those emotional questions, tell me like what that, give me an example.
I don't think it's how do you feel about taking your kids to such and such, in the woke world today? And she'll say, "Okay, Ma, I gotta go."
Gotta go. Okay, so I'll say two things. The first is, and I don't think this is not intentional on your part. This is not something you're doing wrong. The best questions are questions that are genuinely curious and don't suggest their own answers. And so if we say, by the way, how do you feel about taking your kids to Disneyland 3 times in a year? Or how do you feel about letting your kids eat dessert every night? I think your daughter knows there's some answers that you're looking for and some answers that you aren't. And so when we say through our question, how do you feel about taking your kids in this woke world? What she's saying is, I don't want to have a conversation about wokeness. You're not actually asking, you're not necessarily, the way she reads it is, you're not asking me about me. You're asking me about a bigger question. And so a much better way to put it is to say, you guys are going on vacation. Are you excited? Tell me about how you're feeling about the vacation. Or do you like the kids' schools? How's it going? The more open-ended we make the question, and more importantly, the more we ask them how they feel about something, rather than the facts of that thing, the more we're going to invite them to be open. And here's the next important thing, is that when she answers and she says, yeah, I'm not worried, it's great. Like, we're going to Black Lives Matters protests, it's going to be a great time. I'm letting them get tattoos as much as they want. They both have their ears pierced. Your instinct might be to say, that sounds like a terrible idea. But what we first have to do is we have to prove to them that we're listening and say, what I hear you saying is you want to raise children who believe in justice, who believe in what's right, who feel a sense of freedom and agency in this world. And I'm so proud as a mother to have raised someone who wants that for her kids, because that's all I wanted for you. And at that point, you can say, by the way, how do you think those tattoos are going to go over in 10 or 15 years? And she might not like it, but she'll know that you are listening to her.
I know that's true because I have a son who lives in Argentina, and I said, what do you love about Argentina? And because he knows I want him to come back to the United States. So that's another, okay, Ma, I gotta go.
So sometimes we have to be sensitive, but thank you for the question. Yeah, let's go right here, just right in front, and then I'll come over here.
Just to piggyback on Deborah's question, is it helpful to go through layers from the basically practical, to match someone there and then take it gradually into a deeper conversation? And then the second question, that was my real question, is what is the correlation, or do you have any findings around people's ability with metacognition and then being super communicators? Because I appreciate how you gave us steps to immediately practice it, but is there some sort of relationship there?
Is there some kind of magical thing? So let me answer the second part of your question first, which is, there's been a lot of studies done. So as I mentioned, we are all super communicators. There is somebody who, when you're having a bad day, you get home and you call them because you know that talking to them is just going to make you feel better, right? How many of you, the person you would call pops into your mind right away? You know exactly who that is. That person is a super communicator for you, and you are a super communicator for them. Now, there are some people who can be consistent super communicators. They can do this with anyone. And it's not because they're more charismatic. It's not because they're extroverts. It's not because of anything except that they have recognized that this skill that you use with your friend, asking deep questions, listening closely, proving that you're listening, these are skills that are fungible that you can use with anyone. And the thing about our brains is, because our brains evolved to be so good at communication, they've also evolved to make these skills into habits very, very quickly, unusually quickly. And so if you practice them once or twice or 3 times, the 4th time you do it, you're not even going to realize you're doing it. It's just going to be automatic. So to answer your question, nobody is necessarily born a super communicator. We're all born super communicators. It's about remembering and paying attention to the right things, and then believing and practicing in these skills that allow us to use them. I'll actually mention, among consistent super communicators, they often ask, were you always a good communicator? And almost inevitably, people will say something like, no, in high school, I had real trouble making friends, and so I had to study how kids talk to each other. Or my parents got divorced when I was young, and I had to be the peacemaker between them. Communication is a learned skill, and any of us can learn it. I think we have time for just one more question. I want to, over here.
Hi, thanks for this provocative session. I'm curious about this feel word. How do you feel? Is there some alternative? Because sometimes people don't love that
absolutely.
exact word.
What do you make
know
of
what I
that?
mean?
When that person said that thing to you, what did that mean? How did that strike you? What did that mean to you?
Oh, God,
What does
it
this
was
cancer diagnosis mean to you?
It was crushing. And then I'm like, well, what do you think? Is think a good alternative? Or
Yeah, I mean, anything's a good alternative if you do it.
yeah.
Right? The truth of the matter is, the other reason why super communicators are super communicators is because they experiment. If I told you that you could only be a super reader if you could read Proust the first time you opened a book, you'd be like, I'm never going to be a super reader, right? Because we recognize that learning is something, or reading is something we learn to do. We experiment with it. And the same thing is true. Here's the thing that I would say to sum up. Go find I'm assuming most of the folks in this room are going to vote for the Democratic nominee. Go find a Trump voter. Not someone who's holding their nose in voting for Trump, someone who just is enthusiastic about Trump. Sit down with them and say, look, I'm not going to vote for Trump, but I want to understand what you like about him, how he makes you feel, what is important about this election. And listen and loop for understanding, prove to them that you're listening, ask genuinely curious follow-up questions, and then say, do you mind if I tell you how I feel? And I promise you 2 things. Number 1, they will listen to you back. Number 2, you will still both walk away disagreeing with each other. But that's okay, because that's what this country is about disagreeing with each other and living side by side. Thank you all so much for coming out this morning. Have a fantastic festival. Really appreciate it.
Please join us in the lobby for book signing. Thank you. Please join us in the lobby for the book signing. Thank you.